Did you know that in ancient Greece, it was completely normal for older men to court teenage boys as part of their education? Or that Greek women had their own secret festivals where men were completely banned and things got pretty wild? Today we're diving into some of the most shocking and bizarre sexual practices of ancient Greece that would make modern people's jaws drop. I'm talking about customs that were so different from today that they seem almost unbelievable. But here's the thing, understanding these practices gives us incredible insight into how one of history's most influential civilizations actually lived. The Greeks gave us democracy, philosophy, and theater, but their bedroom habits were definitely not what you'd expect. So buckle up because we're about to explore a side of ancient Greece that your history teacher probably never mentioned. Let's start with probably the most well-known but misunderstood practice, pederasty. This was a formal relationship between an older man, called an erastes, and a younger boy, usually between 12 and 18, called an eraminos. Now before you get the wrong idea, this wasn't just about older men taking advantage of kids. This was actually a structured mentorship system that was considered essential for a young man's education. The older man would teach the boy everything from philosophy and politics to military tactics and social skills. The physical aspect was supposed to be limited and the boy was never supposed to enjoy it sexually. In fact, if a boy showed too much enthusiasm for the physical side, he could be socially ruined. The whole point was that the boy would eventually grow up to become the older mentor to another young man. This practice was so normal that families would actually compete to get their sons paired with respected older men. But here's where it gets really weird, if you were the passive partner as an adult man, that was considered absolutely shameful. Greek society was obsessed with the idea of dominance and submission, and being passive was seen as feminine and degrading. Moving on to something equally shocking, the treatment of women in Athens versus Sparta. In Athens, respectable women were basically kept locked up in their houses. They couldn't go to the market, attend theater performances, or even eat dinner with their husbands if there were guests. But here's the twist, this created a whole class of women called Hetairai who were basically high-class companions. These women were educated, witty, and provided both intellectual and sexual companionship to wealthy men. Some Hetairai became incredibly powerful and wealthy, like Aspasia, who was Pericles' partner and influenced Athenian politics. But the regular wives? They were expected to stay home, have babies, and basically be invisible. Now let's talk about Sparta, where things were completely different and honestly pretty bizarre. Spartan women had way more freedom than Athenian women, but their marriage customs were absolutely wild. When a Spartan man got married, he would literally kidnap his bride on their wedding night. But get this, he would dress her up as a man, shave her head, and leave her alone in a dark room. Then he would sneak in later under cover of darkness to consummate the marriage. This wasn't a one-time thing either, Spartan husbands would continue these secret nighttime visits for months or even years. They believed that this secrecy and difficulty would make their desire stronger and produce better children. Some Spartan couples didn't even see each other in daylight until they had several children together. The Spartans also practiced something called wife sharing, which sounds exactly like what you think. If a man thought another man had good qualities, he might lend him his wife to produce children. Or if an older man had a young wife, he might invite a younger man to father children with her. This wasn't considered adultery or cheating, it was seen as a practical way to produce the strongest possible Spartan warriors. Now let's dive into the religious festivals, because this is where things get really wild. The Greeks had several festivals that were basically religious orgies. The most famous was the Dionysian festivals, dedicated to the god of wine and ecstasy. These started as religious ceremonies but often turned into massive parties with lots of drinking and sexual activity. Both men and women would participate, often wearing masks and costumes to hide their identities. The idea was that by losing control and giving in to physical desires, they were connecting with the divine. But even weirder were the women-only festivals like the Thesmophoria. These were secret religious festivals where married women would leave their homes for several days. Men were completely banned, and we don't know exactly what happened because the women never talked about it. But ancient writers hinted that these festivals involved sexual rituals and ceremonies that would shock people. Some scholars think the women used certain objects and performed rituals that were supposed to ensure fertility for their crops and families. There was also the Adonia festival, where women would go up on rooftops and perform rituals mourning the death of Adonis. These festivals often involved women acting in ways that would normally be completely unacceptable in Greek society. Let's talk about prostitution, because the Greeks had a whole complex system that might surprise you. There were basically 3 types of sex workers in ancient Greece. At the bottom were the pornai, these were usually slaves or foreign women who worked in brothels. Then there were the olatrides, flute girls who provided entertainment and sexual services at parties. At the top were the Hetairai we mentioned earlier, educated companions who could charge huge fees. But here's what's really interesting, male prostitution was also common and completely legal. Young men would often work as prostitutes to earn money, but there was a catch. If you worked as a male prostitute, you lost certain citizenship rights forever. You couldn't hold public office, speak in the assembly, or even enter certain temples. So while it was legal, it came with serious long-term consequences. The Greeks also had some very specific ideas about what was sexually acceptable. For example, oral sex was considered degrading for both men and women. They had a word, katapaigon, which was basically the worst insult you could call someone. It meant someone who enjoyed being penetrated, and it could ruin a man's reputation completely. But at the same time, they were totally fine with practices that we might find strange today. Greek pottery shows us that they were very open about sexuality in general. They decorated everyday objects like cups and plates with explicit sexual images. These weren't hidden away, they were used at dinner parties and social gatherings. Some of the images are so graphic that museums today still keep them in restricted sections. Now let's talk about marriage and what that actually meant in ancient Greece. In Athens, girls were typically married off when they were around 14 years old. Their husbands were usually much older, sometimes in their 30s. The marriage was arranged by the girl's father, and she had absolutely no say in the matter. But here's the weird part, the marriage ceremony itself involved some pretty bizarre customs. The bride would be bathed in water from a sacred spring, carried by a specific type of vessel called a lotrophoros. Then she would be driven to her new husband's house in a cart, while people threw nuts and dried fruits at her. The couple would eat a special cake together, and then the bride would be led to the bedroom while everyone sang outside. But the strangest part was what happened the next morning. The new husband would receive gifts from friends and family, almost like he had accomplished some great feat. Meanwhile, the bride would often be crying because she had just been separated from everything she had ever known. Greek men also had very different ideas about fidelity than we do today. It was completely acceptable for a married man to have relationships with prostitutes, slaves, or young men. But if his wife even looked at another man, she could be divorced and lose all her rights. Some city-states had laws that said if a woman was caught in adultery, her husband was required to divorce her. She would then lose the right to attend any religious festivals or wear jewelry. If she broke these rules, anyone could assault her on the street without legal consequences. Let's dive into some of the more unusual sexual practices that were specific to certain regions. In some parts of Greece, there was a practice called night crawling. Young unmarried men would sneak into houses at night to visit unmarried women. This was semi-accepted as long as the man wasn't caught by the woman's family. If he was caught, it could lead to serious conflict or even violence. But if he wasn't caught, it was seen as a sign of his skill and the woman's desirability. Another bizarre practice was the use of certain plants and substances as aphrodisiacs or contraceptives. The Greeks were obsessed with a plant called silphium, which was supposed to prevent pregnancy. This plant was so valuable that it was worth its weight in silver and eventually went extinct from overharvesting. Women would also use various herbs and rituals that were supposed to make them more attractive or fertile. Some of these involved pretty gross ingredients that I won't go into detail about. The Greeks also had some very specific ideas about what made someone sexually attractive. For women, being pale was considered beautiful because it showed you didn't have to work outside. They would use lead-based makeup to make their skin whiter, which obviously was poisoning them. For men, having a small penis was actually considered more attractive and civilized. Large penises were associated with barbarians and animals, so Greek art always shows men with very small genitals. This is completely opposite to modern Western ideals, which shows how much cultural attitudes can change. Now let's talk about some of the religious aspects of sexuality in ancient Greece. The Greeks had several gods and goddesses associated with love and sexuality. Aphrodite was the goddess of love and beauty, but she was also associated with prostitution. Many temples to Aphrodite employed sacred prostitutes who served the goddess by providing sexual services. The most famous was the temple at Corinth, which supposedly had over 1,000 sacred prostitutes. Men would come from all over Greece to participate in these religious sexual rituals. The idea was that by having sex with a sacred prostitute, you were honoring the goddess and ensuring her favor. There was also Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, whose festivals often involved sexual activity. His followers, called Maenads, were women who would leave their homes and families to follow him through the wilderness. These women were said to engage in wild sexual behavior and even violence while under the god's influence. The Greeks believed that this kind of religious ecstasy was necessary for spiritual growth and connection with the divine. But probably the strangest religious sexual practice was something called hieros gamos, or sacred marriage. This involved ritual sexual acts that were supposed to ensure fertility for the entire community. Sometimes this involved the king or high priest having ceremonial sex with a priestess. Other times it involved more complex rituals with multiple participants. The exact details were kept secret, but these ceremonies were considered essential for the community's survival. One of the most shocking things about Greek sexuality was how they treated rape. In many cases, rape was considered more of a property crime against a woman's male relatives than a crime against the woman herself. If a man raped an unmarried woman, he might be forced to marry her and pay a fine to her father. But the woman had no say in this arrangement and would be stuck married to her attacker. If a married woman was raped, her husband might divorce her because she was considered polluted. This could leave the woman completely destitute with no way to support herself. The only exception was if the woman could prove she fought back and didn't consent. But even then, she would often face social stigma and suspicion for the rest of her life. Now let's talk about homosexuality in ancient Greece, because it's much more complicated than most people think. While relationships between older and younger men were accepted, adult male relationships were much more complicated. If both men were adults and citizens, their relationship had to follow very specific rules to be socially acceptable. One man had to be clearly dominant and the other submissive, and this often corresponded to differences in age or social status. Female homosexuality was much less talked about, but it definitely existed. The most famous example is Sappho, the poet from the island of Lesbos. Her poetry describes intense relationships with other women, though scholars debate whether these were sexual or just emotional. There were also religious contexts where women might have sexual relationships with each other. Some all-female religious communities probably included sexual relationships, though the details are unclear. The Greeks also had some very strange ideas about conception and pregnancy. They believed that women were basically just vessels for growing babies, and that men provided all the important genetic material. Some philosophers thought that women didn't contribute anything to the child except providing a place for it to grow. This led to some bizarre theories about how to influence the sex and characteristics of unborn children. Pregnant women were given all sorts of strange instructions about what to eat, how to sit, and even what to think about. Some people believed that if a pregnant woman looked at beautiful statues, her child would be more attractive. Others thought that the position during conception could determine whether the child would be male or female. These ideas influenced everything from architecture to diet, as people tried to create the perfect conditions for producing children. So there you have it, some of the most bizarre and shocking sexual practices of ancient Greece. From formalized relationships between men and boys to secret women-only festivals and sacred prostitution, the Greeks had a completely different approach to sexuality than we do today. What's fascinating is how these practices were deeply connected to their ideas about education, religion, and social structure. The Greeks weren't just being weird for the sake of it, they had complex reasons for these customs that made sense within their culture. It really shows us how much human sexuality and relationships are shaped by the society we live in. What surprised you most about these ancient Greek practices? Did any of them challenge what you thought you knew about ancient history? Let me know in the comments below. I love hearing your thoughts on these historical topics. If you enjoyed learning about this hidden side of ancient Greece, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more fascinating historical content. And if you want to see more videos about unusual historical practices, let me know what civilization or time.